1415 saw the beginning of the final phase of the 100 Years' War. Henry V had just become king of fractured England. France was ruled by an ill king, Charles VI. The two realms would collide at a battle of epic proportions. The prize up for grabs was the crown of France itself. I'm Matt Lewis, this is History Hit, and you're watching Battle Command. In April 1413, King Henry V of England is crowned at Westminster Abbey. He's inherited a fractured kingdom. His father, Henry IV, had seized the crown from his cousin, Richard II, deposing the old king and never sitting easily on his throne afterwards. Henry needed a way to unite England behind him, and one thing that Henry knew was war.
By the time of Agincourt, Henry is 29 years old. He's a serious man with more than a decade of military experience gained in his father's Welsh campaigns. He had his first taste of battle at Shrewsbury, aged 16, when he was struck in the face by an arrow. His portrait is believed to be in profile to hide that scar.
Henry knew that the easiest way to unite his kingdom behind him was to give them a common target, and he set his sights on France. By 1415, he'd raised about 12,000 men and was at Southampton on the south coast of England preparing to set sail. Henry knows that now is the perfect time to strike at France. They've hardly ever been more vulnerable. The man in charge there is King Charles VI, who is often referred to as Charles the Mad. He suffered from severe mental health issues that frequently made him incapable of ruling his own kingdom. With an unstable king on the throne, France's entire future would depend on Charles d'Albret, the Constable of France's ability to unite a fractured kingdom behind him. He began to muster forces and prepared to defend the northern coast of France, where Edward III had landed previously and where they thought Henry might land now. All they can do now is wait. In August 1415, Henry set sail from Southampton. His ships moved out into the Channel, making the sea look like a forest of masts, with sails that billowed in the wind, and ships packed with men who went towards an uncertain future. Would this bring them glory, or would this bring them death?
It's thought Henry had mustered an army of 12,000 men. Whilst that number and the number of ships used can be debated, what we can say for sure is that Henry's army had a novel composition for the time. He had a ratio of around 3 archers to every man-at-arms, an unusually high reliance on bowmen that could pose a big problem when facing French heavy cavalry.
The French were expecting Henry to land on the north coast where they'd been preparing for him, but Henry had other ideas. He instead landed just to the east of their defences at the port town of Harfleur. This was a strategically vital town, often used to mount fleets across the Channel, but which also gave access to the river that ran through France into Rouen and all the way down to Paris. This, Henry thought, would be the padlock that would allow him control of France. He believed he'd take the city quickly, but Harfleur was prepared. They'd bolstered their defences. They'd laid down provisions for a long siege. Rather than taking the town in a few days, it took Henry 5 weeks.
A monk at the Cathedral of Saint-Denis described the suffering and the efforts of those within Harfleur. Without any doubt, these men were worthy of the highest praise for their endurance of every adversity. Even as the roofs of the buildings were crashing in around them, they remained continuously in arms, sustained by the most meagre rations and spending their nights without sleep so that they were prepared to repel any sudden assaults.
When the city eventually fell, there was no Shakespearean glorious once more unto the breach, but rather the city was starved until it was forced to surrender. Henry finally had his first victory in France, but at what cost? Some estimates suggest he'd lost around half of his army. Illness had set in during the siege. Many of his men were affected by dysentery, violent diarrhea. Many were killed. Many more had to be sent home. And so as Henry thought about his next move from Harfleur, he was confronted by a number of problems. He needed to lose more men to leave a garrison in Harfleur to keep it safe, so that now his army was overwhelmingly made up of archers. And that was an unusual force for anyone to have to think about fighting an enemy with. Henry now has to work out what to do next, and he does have several options from where he is. He could just cut his losses and sail home and try to sell winning Harfleur as a glorious victory, but that's not going to get him the unity at home that he so desperately needs. It would feel like a lot of wasted men and money to take one town. He could stay where he is in Harfleur and fortify his position, but the French are beginning to gather their forces and he'd be a sitting duck. He could sail along the coast to Calais, the nearest town still in English hands, and there he could muster his forces and think about how he might push further into France. But what Henry does decide to do takes everybody by surprise, including his own men. He does decide to head to Calais, but they're going to do so by foot. They're going to march their way along the north coast of France. As they made their way along the coast, they eventually reached the River Somme. His problem really now was that on the other side was a large French force, shadowing him along the river. They were forced further and further south into France along the River Loire until they reached Corbeil. There was a skirmish between the English forces and the French, which the English got the better of and captured some French soldiers. Here, Henry had his first real stroke of luck. Under intense interrogation, those French prisoners revealed the existence of a French battle plan to defeat Henry's army. They were to rely on heavy cavalry coming in from the flanks to plough through Henry's archers and drive them from the field. In response to this, Henry ordered that all of his archers should find themselves a 6-foot wooden stake, sharpen it at both ends, and carry it with them from now on. It would be planted in front of them if they were to give battle to the French to provide a shield. And so all of those tired, disheartened, hungry, and sick men now also had to carry a 6-foot stake with them. Henry eventually managed to force a crossing of the River Somme, but by now the constable Charles d'Albret had caught up with him, and a French army was still blocking his path to Calais. On the 20th of October, a French delegation came to the English king and made him an offer. Meet us in 4 days' time at Aubigny, and we will have a battle there. It was a strange offer for the French to make. They had the numbers on Henry. They could have crushed him in the field where he stood. Instead, they chose what I imagine they thought was the chivalric option to appoint a time and a place and allow people to prepare for battle.
Chivalry is, well, it's complicated. Theoretically, it guides the lives and actions of knights, preventing them from attacking defenceless peasants, requiring them to protect widows and children and those who need their help. It held strong currency in France, but it's questionable whether anyone really adhered to it too closely when push came to shove. It was the medieval bro code that everyone said they followed, but most dropped when it became inconvenient.
Henry gratefully accepted the offer. The French began to march towards Aubigny, and Henry followed, slowly, and leaning a little bit to the left, until the French were far enough ahead that he broke away and made a mad dash for Calais. The space had been cleared for him, and he had no intention of facing the superior French army at Aubigny. Charles d'Albret knew where Henry was going. There was only one place he was going to head for. Outraged at the lack of chivalry shown by the English king, they committed to cut him off before he could reach Calais and force him to give battle. Fate would see the two armies collide at a place known as Agincourt. Henry now had no choice but to fight the French, and it wasn't really on ground of his choosing. He was going to have to make the best of a bad situation. And if we switch to this map, we can see the lie of the land that Henry found himself having to fight in. Here in the middle was a wide ploughed field. The fresh soil turned over wouldn't be very good for the French cavalry, so Henry was relying on that to help him out a little bit. And either side was thick forest, so that it would funnel the French into this narrower area and discount their numbers as much as Henry possibly could.
With a much smaller force composed of mostly archers, Henry couldn't have asked for a more favourable battlefield.
On the evening of the 24th of October, as Henry is arriving at the site of Agincourt, he's greeted by the sight of the vast ranks of the French on the ridge opposite him. He can see just how many numbers they've managed to put in the field, perhaps as many as 25,000 men. As Henry prepared for bed on the night of the 23rd of October, he must have known that the next day was going to be a trial. He knew how dangerous, how precarious this moment could be for him, for all of his men, and for the crown of England. While the French loudly set their camp on the ridge to the top of the field, the English remained quiet, perhaps solemn, worried what was to come for the day before. All that Henry could do was hope that God would be on his side. And at some point in the night, it seemed like his prayers might have been answered. When Henry awoke on the morning of the 25th of October, though, and began to lay out his men ready for the battle, he did have a stroke of luck. During the night, it had rained. The ploughed field that was between the English and the French had become a boggy quagmire, and Henry knew that he could make use of this later. Henry laid out his army with the few men-at-arms that he had left, maybe 1,000 or so men, and amongst them he set out his archers. They were on both flanks, and he also set some up in the middle. He was probably at a ratio of about 4-1 here, archers to men-at-arms. So if he had about 1,000 men-at-arms, he's got about 4,000 archers. They're angled to create overlapping fields of fire into which the French are going to have to venture. But this was a deeply unusual way for a medieval commander to have to fight a battle. He's got way too many archers. But Henry, nevertheless, takes to the field, right in the centre, leading his men. He is going to put his own life in peril alongside them. And that was a stark contrast to the French. The king wasn't here. The prince wasn't here either. There was lots of confusion about who had the right to lead the French. Charles d'Albret, though, as constable, took main control of the army. And he set out with men-at-arms in the middle. He had perhaps as many as 10,000. He laid out his archers towards the rear of his army. There was a mixture of archers and crossbowmen there, perhaps as many as 5,000 of them too. He set out a wing of heavy cavalry on either side, just as Henry had known from the stolen battle plans that he would do. The French cavalry were made up of knights. This is the archetype of what we think of as the medieval chivalric figure. It's a man encased in steel, sitting on top of a war horse with his lance couched, a sword or a mace at his side too. They were a devastating threat on a medieval battlefield, something that Henry knew he was going to have to counter. Charles d'Albret was also able to add to this another rank of mounted men. These were largely servants, those who made up the entourage of the knights, the squires, the men who looked after his armour and his food and his clothes and his horse. Charles d'Albret decided to put all of them on a mount too. There were maybe another 10,000 of them. This meant that the French had upwards of 25,000 men in the field against 5,000 or 6,000 ill, demoralised and hungry Englishmen. It wasn't looking too good for Henry. There are stories that some of the archers were so ill with dysentery that at the beginning of the battle they were forced to cut out the rear of their hose and allow the diarrhea to just flow freely into the mud. It's just another aspect of Agincourt that makes the English cause so desperate. Despite their illness and desperation, Henry has had each of those archers bury that 6-foot stake that they've been carrying around France with them in front of them as an obstacle pointing towards the French cavalry charge that he knows is going to come. If I had to place a bet on the outcome of Agincourt before it began, the English are fatigued. They've got much smaller numbers. They're going to have to rely heavily on their archers. The French have got absolutely overwhelming numbers. Their heavy cavalry might struggle on that muddy field after the rain though. I think, given the sheer weight of numbers though, I'd have to put my money on the French. They've got to win the Battle of Agincourt. Accounts of the battle will tell us that just before the fighting began, the English, the archers and the men-at-arms fell to their knees and offered up their prayers to God. The accounts talk about them taking a piece of mud from the ground and maybe putting it under their tongue in their mouth or making a sign of a cross on their forehead with the mud. It was almost like an admission that they knew they might not make it off this field alive. They were just desperate for God's blessing. And if they really had cut away the backs of their hose and they were having diarrhea all over the floor, I'm not sure why you'd want to put a bit of that mud in your mouth or smear it across your face. Conventional medieval wisdom teaches that the army that moves first will lose the battle. At Agincourt, this played into French hands. They had all the time in the world. In fact, there were more reinforcements due to be joining them at any time. They had plenty of food, plenty of wine. They could do this all day. Henry, on the other hand, knew that he couldn't wait. The French numbers are only going to go up. His men are already hungry and desperate. They can't sit here and wait. And so Henry makes a bold decision. He's going to defy conventional military wisdom and he's going to move his army. The first order that he gives is for the baggage train to be brought up from the rear behind the army. This gives him a bit of extra protection from an attack from the rear, but also prevents the baggage train from being looted by locals or French soldiers. Henry then orders all of those exhausted archers to pull their 6-foot stakes back up out of the sucking mud and to move them forward. This must have been a Herculean effort for them all to undertake, but nevertheless, the English advance and are then given the order to replant all of those stakes. For me, this feels like the critical moment of this battle. This is an incredibly bold or foolhardy move from Henry. He's risking everything by moving his men forward. If the French had spotted them lifting out their spikes and walking forward, it would have been the perfect time for them to have charged and run the English down while they were undefended. Instead, reports tell us that the French soldiers had dismounted. They were getting a drink, refreshing themselves instead. They simply hadn't noticed what the English were up to. If they had, the Battle of Agincourt could have been a very different affair. With his men now within longbow range of the enemy, Henry gave the order to begin to shoot. The air was filled with clouds of sharp arrows and barbs. And this is a good moment for us to break and take a look at the medieval longbow.
This is a medieval style warbow, and I love this weapon. It really is the great leveller on a battlefield. In the 14th and throughout the 15th century, this is English army's weapon of choice. It becomes utterly devastating, and particularly the French struggle to find any answer to this. And part of the reason that the English became so good with it is that every Sunday from the middle of the 14th century onwards, Englishmen were required by law to train with one of these after church. So theoretically, you had a whole adult population who could pick one of these up at a moment's notice and use it to devastating effect on the battlefield. I'm going to try and put the theory that anybody can pick this up to the test, though. Let's go and see what damage this might have done to our poor cabbage. Well, I mean, you can see it's gone right the way through and out a good 6-7 inches out of the other side. Imagine that was someone's head, someone's body. It's getting through and it's doing an awful lot of damage.
And so, with Henry's order, the English began to unleash their arrows. The sky must have darkened as thousands of arrows began to make their way across the field. The French were going to have to fight in the shade. If you know, you know. It was now the French who knew that they couldn't simply stand still and endure the onslaught of the vicious barbs of the English arrows. Just as Henry had known they would, they ordered the heavy cavalry to attack, aiming for the archers on his wings. And this is where Henry's overnight luck came into play. The rain had made the ploughed field muddy. The heavy cavalry were getting bogged down. They were finding it almost impossible to build up any kind of speed across the field. And as they got closer, they also had to contend with all of those stakes that had been planted in front of the archers. They were stopping the horses dead, and the terrified mounts were turning around, running away, causing chaos, throwing their riders to the ground. Those who fell off found themselves pulled down into the sucking mud, unable to get up in their armour. They'd be trampled further into it, or perhaps even drown as their helmets filled up with mud. Those who were able continued to try to press forward to reach the English lines. And at the same time, Charles d'Albret gave the order for the men-at-arms to begin to press forward too. They found the mud equally hard going. They were struggling to get across the field behind the cavalry. As they drew ever closer, it became clear that the cavalry were getting pressed further against the English, and nobody was making any ground.
Let's just pause here for a second. I know what you're thinking. Isn't this exactly what the French just did? Well,
exactly! And that is what is so brilliant about it. It will catch the watchful Hun totally off guard. Doing precisely what we've done 18 times before is exactly the last thing they'll expect us to do this time.
the French had the numbers, supplies, and time on their side. They could have paused and drawn breath. Instead, desperate for glory, they continued to throw themselves forward in wave after wave. It perhaps demonstrates the difficulty of shifting tactics during a medieval battle. The French simply didn't appear to have a plan B. The English, though, would run out of arrows at some point.
Those English spikes were doing their job of keeping the French cavalry at bay as the archers continued to pick off targets. And those woods on either side were doing exactly what Henry had known they would. They were narrowing the field for the French, so they simply couldn't bring their numbers to bear. They couldn't outflank the English forces. As the fighting becomes tighter and more compressed and ever more desperate, Henry is still at the front, fighting alongside all of his men. At one point in the battle, his younger brother, Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, is injured by a knife in the groin and falls to the ground. As Humphrey watches the French gather around him, he must have been terrified that they were about to deliver the coup de grace, the killing blow. They were going to finish him off. When all of a sudden his vision was filled by a literal knight in shining armour stepping over him and fighting the French away so that others could drag Humphrey to safety. That figure that had stepped over him, protected him, saved his life, was his older brother, Henry V. And it may be at this point that Henry was so close to the enemy that one of the French managed to chop away a piece of the crown that Henry was wearing on top of his helm. He was putting his own life in peril alongside his desperate men.
A chaplain who was with Henry's army paints a gruesome picture. So great was the undisciplined violence and pressure of the mass of men behind that the living fell on top of the dead, and others falling on top of the living were killed as well, with the result that in each of the 3 places where the strong contingents guarding our standards were, such a great heap grew of the slain and of those lying crushed in between.
By now the English archers are running out of arrows. They've bought a huge supply, but they can't last forever. They begin to pick up daggers, knives, the mallets that they've been using to drive their stakes into the ground, the weapons of those who have fallen around them, and they begin to clamber around their barricades and operate as men-at-arms now, finishing off anyone unfortunate enough to have fallen in the mud, but not quite been dead yet. The French were becoming ever more compressed, packed into a smaller and smaller space. Their situation was becoming so desperate that eventually they broke and they turned and began to flee away from the fighting, making their way back through the thick mud of the battlefield. Charles d'Albret, though, was amongst those who had fallen in the fighting. The cavalry too, or at least what was left of them, was forced to try and make their way back through the mud. It's now that we get one of the most controversial moments of the Battle of Agincourt. The English had been busy taking as many high-status prisoners as they possibly could. They were worth a fortune in ransom. A man could get rich if he captured the right French nobleman. All of the prisoners had been gathered towards the back of the English army, and it was now that a rumour sprang up that French reinforcements were about to arrive on the field. Some of the stories say that they were expected to attack from the rear. Henry was suddenly left with a dilemma and made a decision that's haunted his reputation ever since. Henry gave the order to kill all of the prisoners of war. This was something that people have criticised Henry for ever since. It's considered by many to be a vicious and a brutal war crime. It's interesting, though, that no contemporary, and especially no contemporary French writer, criticises Henry at all on this point. Under the rules of military warfare, Henry's main concern had to be his own men. If there was a French relief force coming from the rear, these prisoners could be freed, rearmed, and they might attack his own force. Henry then was making a decision that everybody around him understood, however distasteful it might be. It soon became clear that those French reinforcements weren't actually going to arrive, and Henry rescinded the order to kill the prisoners. It's not clear how many were actually put to death before the order was withdrawn, but it was enough to stain Henry's reputation ever since. A significant portion of the French forces hadn't ever engaged at the Battle of Agincourt. The archers and crossbowmen had been positioned at the back. They couldn't use their weapons at all for fear of hitting their own men. They'd probably been put at the back because all of the French cavalry and noblemen wanted the glory of engaging with the English. They didn't want to hand that over to archers and crossbowmen. Those mounted servants never engaged at the Battle of Agincourt. They simply watched this chaos unfurl, probably uncertain what to do. So many of the French nobility and leadership were either killed or captured at this point that they simply had no one left to give them orders. They had no direction, no clue what they ought to do next. Despite that lack of leadership though, they somehow make the collective decision that the battle's over. They're going to withdraw from the field of Agincourt. But what do the French leave behind? Well, the English casualties are minimal, maybe as few as just over 100, perhaps 500 or 600 at the most. On the French side though, their army had been decimated. Casualties were estimated at around about 6,000, with maybe another 700 or so taken prisoner. And that included some of the most senior nobility, some of the most important men in France. For me, the key factor at Agincourt is the sheer desperation of the English, fighting against all of the odds for their very lives, rather than some abstract notion of glory. Now it's time for the MMVC, Matt's most valuable commander. MVC at Agincourt, is there any other candidate than Henry V? He's led from the front, he's inspired this ragtag group of soldiers to defeat the flower of French chivalry. He simply has to be the most valuable commander of the day. The terrible defeat at Agincourt left France, an already fractured kingdom, further broken apart, and created the space into which Henry would begin to finalise his conquest of the Kingdom of France. Agincourt is a name that would go down in history, the 25th of October 1415, and this would set the scene for Henry to become heir to the Kingdom of France. I've been Matt Lewis, and you've been watching Battle Command from History Hit. This has been the Battle of Agincourt, one of the most famous encounters of the medieval world. And for me, the English warbow has to go down in history as one of the greatest weapons ever created. Let me know what you think about that. You can also let us know in the comments any other battles that you'd like to see us cover here at Battle Command, and you can check out more videos about the Battle of Agincourt and this whole period on the channel too. You've made it to the end of the credits. Thank you very much for sticking with this film. I've pointed you at a couple of other History Hit films that you can go and watch, but people are always asking for book recommendations about periods and topics like this. So I've dug out a couple of really good reads about the context and the battle at Agincourt. The first is Juliet Barker's book, Agincourt. I absolutely love this book. It's really, really great at laying out all of the context in the build-up to the battle and exactly what happened on the day too. Makes great use of original source material. The second is Michael Livingston's Agincourt. I mean, they're both called Agincourt. What else are you going to call it? This is a really good, fresh look at what we do know and what we're not so sure about with the Battle of Agincourt. Michael Livingston has a great way of questioning what we think we know and coming up with new interpretations of some of the most fascinating bits of history. So give those both a look out if you want to find out more about the Battle of Agincourt.